Hi, I'm Nick Byrd. I'm a philosopher and a scientist, and I study the way people think, as well as ways that we can help people improve the way that they think. Before I get into all the details, I find it's usually helpful to tell people, yeah, I have heard that I look like a person, and it's not that bothersome. In fact, it's probably beneficial to look like somebody who seems to be so talented and well-liked. But on to the research. So one of my primary areas of focus is what people call reflective reasoning. Reflective reasoning has been a preoccupation in the Western philosophical tradition, according to John Doris, in both historical and in contemporary contexts. So what do we mean by this? Well, Christine Korsgaard has made a certain metaphorical description of reflection rather famous. She reports, I find myself with an impulse to believe, but then I back up and I bring that impulse into view, and then I have a certain distance. And now the impulse doesn't dominate me, and I have a problem. Shall I believe? Well, it turns out that unreflective judgments, sometimes called intuitions, are also standard fare in philosophy. Philosophers are often appealing to whatever their intuition is about a particular case in order to make a further point about their view. As Hilary Kornblith puts it, George Beeler does it, Roderick Chisholm does a lot, most philosophers do it openly and unapologetically, and the rest arguably do it too, although some of them would deny it. Well, it turns out this distinction between reflective and unreflective reasoning is a kind of hot topic in cognitive science and psychology and some other fields as well. So, because I study both philosophy and cognitive science, this was kind of a natural place for me to focus. So what is reflection and what is it for? Well, Taylor tells us the role of reflection is to step back from the immediate situation, maybe calculate consequences or compensate for the immediate force of one desire, a desire that might not be advantageous to follow. Jennifer Nagel says that even advanced reflection and training does not necessarily insulate us from illusion, however. For example, physics graduate students and postdoctoral researchers still experience the characteristic cognitive perceptual illusions of naive impetus theory physics, illusions that are explicitly at odds with their theoretical knowledge. You might be aware that scientists have developed various tests to understand how reflectively people reason. So perhaps the most famous example of one of these test questions is the bat and the ball problem. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball, so how much does the ball cost? 10 cents is the answer that jumps to most people's mind immediately, but if you actually reread that question and think a bit more carefully, you might realize actually 10 cents can't be correct. The correct answer would have to be less, and you might eventually realize the correct answer is 5 cents. So in my research, I use tests like this, although more novel and less familiar and often less mathematical tests, to lure people towards a particular response that, upon reflection, they can realize is demonstrably incorrect, and then perhaps find a correct answer. So I use these tests to figure out if people tend to just go with their gut or their first impulse, or tend to double check and perhaps correct that impulse. One of the things that I've talked about in my research is what I call bounded reflectivism. So some people think that reflective reasoning is just absolutely crucial and essential for good judgment and action, and there are these other people who think that reflective reasoning doesn't really deliver any of that goodness that people think it's so crucial for. You could call these people reflectivists on the one hand and anti-reflectivists on the other. In my research, I kind of pave the middle way, saying that, look, reflective reasoning can give us some goods, right? So when you're at a restaurant and you calculate the tip and you realize you've made a mistake, you're now reflecting, and then you can correct it via reflective reasoning about however you decide to give tips. But in other situations, perhaps, if somebody is challenging us, we might use our reflective reasoning to defend the certain belief that we feel deeply attached to, rather than sort of dispassionately accept the best arguments and evidence. And so reflection can be great, or it can maybe lead to problems. There's also some evidence that reflection might just not have an impact at all. The bounded reflectivist model is sort of an algorithmic model of how that could be the case, how we could get these kind of seemingly mixed results from one type of reasoning. I've also done studies where I have people think out loud while they're solving a reflection test, so I can sort of understand every step along the way, because there's various assumptions about how people do solve these tests, even though most of the time researchers are only looking at people's final answer. They don't look at what their first impulse was, whether they overcame that impulse before they arrived at the correct answer. They're assuming that that's how people arrive at the correct answer. And in some of my research, I find that a substantial minority of people don't actually follow that trajectory. They do something else, which tells us that we might need to correct our assumptions about the way people solve these tests. Something else I've studied is the way that reflective reasoning relates to philosophical thinking. So, for example, sacrificial moral dilemmas, where you have to choose between whether you should cause some harm for the sake of some greater good, like pulling the switch in a trolley problem is the kind of toy example of that, or whether you should just abstain from causing any harm altogether, even though that would result in a worse overall outcome than causing some harm for the sake of that greater good. Contrary to some prior work, reflective reasoning doesn't predict only the sacrificial harm where you cause some harm for the greater good. It also predicts being unwilling to cause harm overall. But you can only find this if you control for those who seem to be interested in causing harm for the sake of causing harm. They want to pull the switch on the trolley problem even if it doesn't save lives. In some other research that we did during the pandemic, reflective reasoning actually wasn't that big of a predictor of people's responses to the pandemic in terms of following the public health guidance from the Center for Disease Control or similar agencies. What seemed to predict that actually was whether or not people received messages about the pandemic as a flu pandemic or as a COVID-19 pandemic. People who were told that it was just a flu pandemic were much less worried about the pandemic and therefore much less likely to adopt these guidelines. We also found that the more that people felt that they have a duty to help when it doesn't make things worse, the more that they complied with public health recommendations. I've also done some research studying philosophers in particular to see what their philosophical inclinations are and how they relate to reflective reasoning. And I did find that even when you control for nearly a dozen other factors, reflective reasoning or reflection test performance does still predict variance in some of their views about, say, for instance, whether or not they believe in God. The more reflectively people, and philosophers in particular, reason, the less likely they were to believe in God. Studies like this have motivated some grant-funded research with Steve Stitch and Justin Sitzma to look at how this relationship between reflective reasoning and various aspects of religiosity can vary across cultures, because there is some initial evidence that you don't find the correlation I just mentioned among philosophers in every single country and every single religious group, even though you often find it in the aggregate, even in fairly large data sets. So we'll be addressing that puzzle. I also have been doing research funded by the Intelligence Community Postdoctoral Fellowship, trying to develop easy-to-use ways to get people to reason better. So we've developed some software that can help researchers run controlled experiments, not just on individuals, but on groups of people who interact together to see if that interaction can somehow help people reason better in ways that trying to reason on their own might not help as much. In the process of doing that research, we had to come up with some creative tools for making sure that the participants in online surveys were who they said they were, or that they were paying attention, or that they're not using a chatbot or some browser script that casts doubt on whether the data comes from a live, attentive human being. And what we found is that data from some online survey worker platforms had more junk in it than other survey work platforms or than undergraduate students. And so this helped us develop tools to identify this junk data and where to get data from in the future so that we can avoid that junk data down the road. There's various other research projects I have that have been published recently or that I'm still working on, and lots more in the pipeline. So if you want to learn more, or you're watching this video far into the future, you probably want to just go to my website or my social media pages, or I don't know, click on whatever latest video I've uploaded. Thanks for your time.